Before we get started, I want to ask my co-presenter, Donna, a question. Donna, do you have a smartwatch?
I do have a smartwatch, Jean.
How many features do you use?
Maybe 4.
Yeah, so that's the thing. Sometimes, how many times do we have these tools? They have features in them that you don't use because maybe you didn't need them when you first got it and things change and we don't know what our tools can truly do. It's the same thing with Concur. Organizational needs change, people change, regulations change. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today in our tips and tricks, mastering SAP Concur for the experienced administrator. Donna, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience?
Sure. My name is Donna Haskins. I worked for a customer. I was a customer of SAP Concur for 10 years, and now I've worked at Concur for 10 years. For when I first started Concur, I was working with new customers who are just starting their journey with Concur. I've also worked with customers who have been experienced with Concur and just want to make some tweaks, some changes to their sites. And then now I get to work as a select care manager where I get to work with customers who just want to be more strategic in how they work with Concur.
And I'm Jean Dyan. I'm the Global Vice President of Customer Advisory here at SAP Concur. I'm going to turn this over to Donna because she's the real expert here.
Well, we're really excited to talk to you today about some of our favorite aspects of SAP Concur. We consider these to be tools that are in your toolbox for managing your program for travel and spend management. Some of these tools may be very familiar to you, but we want to talk to you about some possible other ways that you could be using them. But some of these tools may be very new to you. And this brings us to my favorite quote. You do not know what you do not know. And so keep that in mind as we talk. We're going to be mentioning some things that you may not be aware of. So we encourage you to ask questions of your peers via the Concur Community Admin Group. If there's something that you also don't know, if you have an expertise in care service, we really encourage you to reach out to your main contact, whether that's your select care manager, your advanced care consultant, or open a case for your essential care. So the main tools that we want to discuss with you today are workflow step options, mapping fields from your credit card feed to custom entry fields, in expense, attendee tracking and detail views, along with printed reports. So let's get started with our first topic, workflow step options.
So before we get started though, I did want to talk about the idea that many of our customers have the same workflow that they had since they've implemented. And if you've implemented maybe even 3, 5, or 7, or 10 years ago, your company has changed dramatically during that time. So are you adding additional steps outside of Concur? Things like email approvals. Maybe you're using a SharePoint where you're dropping approvals onto it and keeping them in a folder so that you can actually use those during an audit. Maybe you're using Teams messaging. Maybe you're keeping spreadsheets that you're attaching to expense reports. I've seen every single one of these with customers, even as recently as a few weeks ago. Sometimes we outgrow the workflow because of M&A or split-offs, the spin-offs. And it's, you know, you can take a good guess at which is the right one and which is the wrong way to do something, or could you improve something because now you know how it works. You may have set something up that was tied back to your paper process, and now you become so advanced that that paper process seems really old. If you have Concur Expense, Concur Request, or Concur Invoice, you have a workflow. And like the watch, you may not be aware of everything that a workflow can do. Why is this important? It's compliance. Auditing, whether it's internal or external auditing, providing documentation of what's happening for legal actions. There's a lot of functionality and options that are contained within a workflow that can really help you maintain your compliance and make it really easy for you to work with some of these other compliance teams to provide exactly what it is that they need. So Donna's going to focus on a very specific part of the workflow steps themselves.
Yes, and I confess, I love workflows. And so today we are showing you on the screen a screenshot of a workflow that's showing the different steps and the roles that are assigned to the workflow steps. Now, for right now, we're going to ignore the system steps, and we're just going to focus on those roles that have the approver and processor in the name. So as Jean mentioned, many customers after go live, they've still been using that workflow that was created during the implementation. And so what's happening is they're finding that users are having to add an ad hoc approver to that workflow. Or sometimes what will happen is, somebody uses a project or goes on a trip, and the approver gets the expense report and says, hey, wait a minute, this actually needs to go to this other person, this other approver. And they use that regularly. So you want to refine your workflow so you're not having to rely on someone's memory. Mm-hmm. So you want to define exactly what you want that workflow to do. So who is it that needs to approve or receive an email at each step? You want to add any additional steps to this workflow that are going to be able to accommodate those correct approvals. Now, this is always a balancing act, right? Because you want to keep your workflow as simple as you can while providing the automation that you need. So a lot of customers, I find, have maybe one person in HR who approves all of the relocation expenses. In that situation, it would be really easy for us to add an authorized approver step that is defined with a specific level. And then you can, in the UI, you can assign that person. It's really easy, and one or two steps, and you're done. Now, if you find yourself in a situation that's more complex, you definitely want to talk to somebody at Concur. There's so much functionality that you can use. We could use a cost object step, a cost object approver step, or an authorized approver step. We may need a feature hierarchy, and that would allow you to use an employee import to automate your authorized approvers. It's just really, please talk to somebody at Concur. Once you define and configure the new steps on this steps page, you can move to the step rules page to define the rules that will tell each step what to do. As you configure the steps, you can also configure rules to dictate what happens when that report or the invoice or request reaches that step. What you do is you're going to choose the new to add a step rule, and it allows you to define conditions you can see on the right side of the screen, just like in an audit rule, an email reminder, or a processor query. A step rule can modify the workflow if there are specific expense types included on the report, request, or invoice. And a good example of this is in request. You can have a step rule that activates if the traveler is going somewhere in a specific country and region group, which means that they need additional vaccinations, or perhaps your security team needs to know where they are so they can talk about security protocols over their computer or the laptop. So you would want that step rule to activate, and I'm going to talk on the next slide a little bit about what that would do. A report contains any exceptions of a specific exception level. In the screenshot, you can see if an audit rule with an exception level of 75 or 90 fires, that report's actually going to stop at the appropriate approval step. Otherwise, if that report doesn't have an audit rule with those levels, it's going to skip that step. I do want to point out on the right side of the screen, there's a newer rule condition to catch a report or invoice if the cost object is no longer active. So this is really exciting because you think about how many times do you have somebody submits an expense report, they create the expense report, and it sits for a minute. It's like, so this condition is actually available in audit rules as well. So in the audit rule, you can stop them from being able to submit if that item is no longer active and then isn't going to be able to post into your ERP system. In the workflow, this is helpful because you think about, let's say that they've submitted the expense report, the cost object was still active, but now it sits in somebody's approval queue for a week and it's no longer active by the time it goes to try to post. So now you can add a workflow step at the end of your workflow, approval flow, so that it will say, hey, wait a minute, this project is no longer active. And you can actually, on the next slide, I'm going to talk to you more about what you could do with that. But so now that we've defined the step rule, we're going to talk about defining the step action. Now you'll notice that on the left side of the screen, for cash advance workflows, there are 4 options, including to reject the cash advance if the step rule is true. For expense, invoice, and request, you have 5 options. Most customers are aware of the skip step. Series of audit rules that fire with a 90 exception level is especially if you have like detect, verify, or intelligent audit, and it's already gone through that, but you want your processors to look specifically at something. That's where we see a lot of customers use a skip step, because if the report doesn't have something, you want it to just continue on to payment. Any report that doesn't meet that is going to skip that final processor step. Send back to employees where that change, if the cost object is no longer active, you can actually have the system send that back to the employee so they can work with their manager to find the correct cost object that expense report should be going to. Change approver is pretty self-explanatory. The next one is generate exception. So this is where you can actually assign an exception in the workflow after the report has been submitted, and then you can use that in reporting from Cognos, or you can drive a workflow step later. A lot of times you'll see customers use this when maybe a delegate approved instead of the normal named approver. And then the last one, which is really cool, is that I want to talk about, is sending an email. And so like I said on the last slide about when someone is going to be traveling to a country, that you want them to be able to notify the security team, you're going to send the email. And that's especially helpful because you want the security team to get that information in real time, but you don't want them to have to approve. Because they really don't need to approve. They don't need to hold up the process anymore. So in requests, we see this, like I said, with the travel request, requires a specific set of vaccinations or security protocols. In invoice or expense, you might see this when a capital expense doesn't have a PO, or maybe it's a computer, hardware, software expense, and that someone's putting through T&E, but it's over certain thresholds. So you want to make sure that you get that classified. So you can send an email to a specific accountant so they know immediately that invoice or that expense report has been submitted, and they can do what they need to do on the back end.
That's amazing. Those are so great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's one tool that maybe you haven't thought of how to use it in those ways.
Yeah. And if we think about another area that I am really passionate about, it's the card feed information. Because I'm passionate about data. And you really shouldn't think about this as just card transactions. It's data. It's incredible data. It's a treasure trove of information. And really, why is that important? Data equals power. Data equals informed decision making. Data equals the ability to make or improve processes. Maybe your reconciliation processes. Maybe it's your reporting processes. Maybe it's just understanding who your vendors are from within a card situation. It can even help with some regulatory requirements. I think I'm going to put that in there as a prelude to what you're going to talk about, Donna. But it's one of those things where the more data you have, the better decisions you can make, and the better off your organization will be. Being able to make those right decisions at the right time is really amazing. So show us what's possible.
Yes, absolutely. So you can see on the screen, I'm showing you parts of the Cognos data warehouse. And so the far left column is the folder structure for your expense folder. It's not even all of it. There's so much data in Cognos. And I find that a lot of customers aren't aware of how much information from credit card feeds are in Cognos. There's so much. And so you'll see that I have taken the credit card transactions, and the 3 columns to the right, that's just all the data from the credit card feed.
Wow.
And so you can see that even those have folders underneath. So there's even more information in each of those folders. Two things I always like to point out to customers is you'll notice on that second column, it shows you the default expense type, and it also shows you the MCC code. And so those are really important information because, as you guys know, if you have company build statements or even if you don't, you can map those MCC codes to an expense type, and you're just helping your end users find the right the right expense type.
Yep.
You can see that information. You can pull that information in. I like to look at it to make sure that MCC codes are mapped to the correct expense type. Then you can add your expense data into that, and you can see where your employees are changing that expense type. And so maybe it's the MCC code is mapped to the wrong expense type for that particular group, or perhaps they're doing something that they're maybe not supposed to. Another way that you can do that, that I see a lot of customers doing more and more of, is just trying to understand what's being put to miscellaneous. And this is a powerful tool to help you with that, because you can take those miscellaneous expenses and you can add the MCC code and the default expense type. And so you can see, where should that expense have gone? Like, are they taking a hotel and they don't want to itemize it, so they're putting it under miscellaneous? This is a tool that can help you understand where they might be doing this. Sometimes there's pieces of data, though, that aren't in your corporate card feed, and it would be so helpful if it was. And that way you can also decide if you want to make it visible to the end user or maybe to the back office within the expense UI. Two big scenarios that I have seen with this. One, I recently had a customer who implemented a virtual credit card feed for their hotel spend in travel. A big issue for them was that the last 4 digits that was coming through in the credit card feed was their master account, and not the actual individual virtual card that is actually shown on the hotel folio. And so they were having trouble reconciling.
Reconciliation must have been a nightmare.
Exactly. So they worked with their travel agency, they worked with Confirma and their credit card vendor, and they were able to get them to add those last 4 digits of the virtual card into the credit card feed. And then we worked with our technical consultants with Concur, because then we can take it, if it's in the credit card feed, if it's in one of these custom fields that you can see in the third column, you can take that data and you can put it into Concur. You can actually map it into the expense entry form. And you can make that hidden, or you can make it visible to the end user, depending on what you need. But for them, they wanted it for the end user so they could make that quick reconciliation. A second scenario that I've seen is I had a customer who had a lot of subsidiaries that were in Latin America. Keep in mind that, they were in Latin America, and what was happening is they all used the same corporate card feed, but each country actually paid the credit card transactions to a specific bank in their country. And so they were having trouble figuring out which ones go where. So they were able to work with their bank, their credit card vendor, to add a banking ID into those transactions. And then they were able to map that into expense. And then they were able to put that on the extract as well as in Cognos, and be able to make those reports and those extracts so that they are able to send the correct information to those banks. Yes, and so if the end user shouldn't see it, you can hide it so only the processor can see it.
That's a really good one. But here's another one of my favorites, attendee tracking. You know, how many of you as customers actually regularly provide information to tax teams or to payroll teams? In talking to customers, I've noticed there isn't a lot of interaction between, and I think it's really important, because when you allow an employee to put a non-cash benefit on an expense report, like maybe a spot bonus, maybe you're giving out gift cards at a giveaway, maybe it's, like a team meeting and, the greatest thing since sliced bread, and here you go, Donna, you get $50. These things matter. They're taxable events. And there's a big implication for organizations that don't track this. And for every company that's ever told me, no, we don't allow that kind of thing on an expense report, I can find it almost immediately. We find it regularly. It's hard because you need to give them a place to record it. It ends up in some of the very randomest of places, including mostly under meal spend, but you can pretty much tell when it's under meal spend. So using an attendee feature to help your tax and payroll teams understand what you have in there gives you accurate reporting and keeps, again, your company compliant with all external regulatory. So I'm going to turn it back over to Donna because she's going to talk a little bit more about how we get to do this.
Exactly. So you can use the attendee functionality to track that spending for spot bonuses and employee gifts. And I'm seeing that more and more with customers just trying to capture that. So one way that you do that is you could add the attendee field to the expense entry form. You can even configure the label so it says recipients so that the manager or someone doesn't feel like they're doing something wrong. That no, this is the recipient of your gift card or your spot bonus. Some things that you're going to want to think about if this is something you want to do is, are you loading all of your employees into Concur? And if you aren't, then how are you going to help employees choose the right attendee? Like if they can create an attendee, how are you going to help them choose that right one? One thing that I used to do as a customer is I did have an audit rule at entry attendee submit that would limit the employee from creating a business guest with the company name. And anytime I found a new one that they tried to slip through, I would update my audit rule. You're also going to make sure that the employee attendee types are available for other employees to see so that you have just one common pool. So you see the same attendees that I see so that we're not creating duplicate attendee databases. So you'll notice that in the attendee settings, you have the ability to define which expense types you want to be included in the annual total of cost per attendee. And you'll also see that in the policy under the expense types, you can actually limit which attendee types are available for the employee to use. So most people's gifts for staff, right? That's pretty clear. Like nobody should be giving one of those to a business guest. And it's really helpful if you do that because then if they do that, they're trying to find that, wait, I can't have the business guest. They realize this is the wrong expense type. I shouldn't be using this. So yes. And then you'll notice that you can also, oops, sorry, I went too far, too quick. You'll notice on the screen to the left, it mentions about displaying the attendee total for the calendar year. So on the attendee detail view, which you may or may not have defined, everybody gets a standard one. But what most people don't realize is that you can add fields to that. And obviously you can see here, this is showing the total amount previous year and the total amount year to date. And this is what we call the attendee detail view. And so you control this, and this is controlled at the policy level. Oh, sorry, it's by the group. And so you can determine who sees this. So if you have a group that's just for your executives and your management, they can see these year-to-date totals, but maybe you don't want your individual contributors to know, oh, Jean got that much as a spot bonus? So you determine that. So you control which columns are visible and the order in which they appear. Excellent. Now, while we're talking about attendee detail view, I want to talk about something real quick, expense detail views. This is really important. Everybody has a standard view, and if you look in, you can see on the right side of the screen where it says expenses and then view, and you can see detail or standard. If you don't have that choice, it means that you don't have an expense detail view defined. And so you just are using standard, which is great, fine. But there's some new functionality that may impact this that you want to be able to use this more. You'll notice that in the top right corner there, it allows you to download as an Excel. So whatever values or whatever data you have that's visible in that detail view for the expense detail view, you can now download into an Excel. which every P card user, every corporate card transaction user, if you have more than 3 to 5 transactions on expense report, this is going to be very powerful. So if you have a group that needs to know what the project code was or needs to know some specific information, anything that's at that expense entry level is game, and you can add it there.
That is a game changer. I really like that. So the last area we're going to talk about is printed reports. I know that many people, myself included, when I was a customer, had to provide a lot of data back to internal and external audit teams around what our employees had been doing, which required us to go back into files and pull things out and print out reports, and it was really difficult. Then we got to providing them with short-term information or short-term login so that they could come in, but still it was a lot of work for us and making sure from a security perspective that everything was done. And how many people, how many of our customers are sending information back to their customers for billing? Again, having to go in, pull everything out, print everything out. It's really kind of a problem. And then of course you have posting purgatory, right? That idea of hidden fields that aren't visible to us, and you don't have time on a 3-day, a 5-day, or a 7-day close to go back in and look at every report. This is why printed reports could be your friend, right? This gives you complete control over which fields appear, how they're formatted, and what supporting details are included. This is a really, really nice feature. I know we always talk about everything being electronic and automated and you don't have to print anything out. There are times where you need this. So Donna, if you could show us how this works, that would be greatly appreciated. I know you'll be a hero to many.
Awesome. Yes, so when we're talking about printed reports, we want to talk about the fact that in Concur Expense and in Concur Request, they're called printed reports. Concur Invoice also has printed invoices. So this functionality is very similar across all of these tools. We're talking about especially if in expense or if you see under print share, this is what we're talking about, and you can have different definitions of what your end user, approver, and processor can see when they go into a specific expense report. So printed reports, printed invoices have 2 pieces. The print template, I can't say that. The print template, which controls how the report looks and what larger options are available, like audit trail and the approval workflow. And then the other piece is the print format, which controls what data elements appear. This is so powerful because you can determine whether the attendees for a meal are on there, where the information is shown, if it's within the line or if it's underneath the line detail, whether you want allocations, itemizations. It's just great. It's just lots of information. So I wanted to show you, in case you're not familiar with what they look like, here's a sample printed report from my Sandbox site. And you can see that it has the approval workflow as well as the actual audit trail. And the receipt image is included. So as Jean said, these are amazing. Customers use these for billable travel packages where they're going to be billing these this travel expense back to their own customers. Like she said, you also see this with audit and compliance scenarios where you might need to share information with your legal group. And then the big one, like she said, is especially if you have an intricate tax configuration and you're trying to understand which is the tax code mismatch that's not allowing this to post in my ERP system, this is really helpful for you to be able to see this at that granular level. All of this makes printed reports a really flexible tool. So how might you use this?
So thank you for being with us. And before you watch the next session, we'd really appreciate your feedback. So please be sure to fill out that form and let us know what you think. And thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.